Hi, I'm Paul Bucciarelli with the Lawrence County Regional Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to Chamber Chat. Today's Chamber Chat guest is attorney Raeann Burgo from the Pittsburgh law firm of Fisher Phillips. Raeann, welcome to Lawrence County Chamber Chat.
Thank you, Paul. It's great to be here. Looking forward to talking about everything with you.
This is the first of 3 videos that we'll be doing that talk about the legal issues that impact businesses. Today's topic is going to be employment laws and complying with them during the recruiting and interviewing process. So Raeann, thank you for taking the time to meet with us today.
Great. And Paul, I just wanted to briefly, introduce myself to the chamber members and let them know my ties to Lawrence County, that I actually was born and raised in Lawrence County and graduated from Shenango High School. So my family's still here. So I'm back in the community and have connections through my family. And Fisher Phillips, although it's a Pittsburgh-based location, they have locations all over the country, that our clients are all up and down Western Pennsylvania, north and south. And so we see clients all over the state, really.
Well, that's great. And it's always good to hear Lawrence County success stories. So thank you again for taking the time today. So Raeann, to start out today, what legal issues impact the recruiting and hiring processes?
Sure. So on a very broad level, when you are talking about any employment decisions, and specifically we're talking today about recruiting and interviewing, you always want to take into consideration your federal and state laws that relate to prohibition of discrimination. So that's your Title VII Civil Rights Act, your Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we're talking about Pennsylvania employers here, probably most of the chamber members are. And so you're talking about Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, which kind of mirrors that Title VII discrimination law, which is probably something a lot of people hear of, which is it prohibits discrimination, based on age and disability, gender, those type of things.
So one of the terms I've heard when I did my research is talking about at-will employees. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So most states in the country are what we call at-will employment states. So that means that an employer hires somebody and they can terminate the relationship for any reason except an illegal one. And that goes both ways, where an employee can end a relationship for any reason without notice also. And so when we talk about for any reason besides an illegal reason, that goes back to what we were talking about with Title VII and the prohibition of discrimination based on certain characteristics. Right. When I didn't mention when we were talking earlier is there's also a couple more specific Pennsylvania laws that I just wanted to mention that employers should be aware of, and that is the Pennsylvania Criminal History Record Information Act and the Pennsylvania Medical Marijuana Act. So you may have heard a lot about the Pennsylvania Medical Marijuana Act is fairly new, so there's a lot of discussion about that. And that really says that you can't discriminate, including in the hiring process, against somebody if they're a medical marijuana user. That doesn't mean that you have to allow or authorize employees to be using medical marijuana while they're working, but that means that you can't just take that one factor and make a decision based on the fact that somebody's a medical marijuana user. And the Pennsylvania Criminal History Record Information Act, in Pennsylvania, you're allowed to ask about somebody's criminal history, but you can only consider felonies and misdemeanor convictions, which is the key word, convictions.
Accusations alone aren't enough to derail any of this?
Right. Accusations alone are not enough to derail this. So it has to be a conviction, it has to be a felony or misdemeanor, and it has to relate to the job duties. So a really good example of this is if you're hiring somebody to be a driver, and one of the qualifications obviously is that you want them to have a driver's license. But if you do a criminal background check and you notice that they have maybe a handful of DUIs, they have a reckless driving conviction, you can take that into consideration in making your employment decision, whether you want to hire them or not, because you can see how that relates to the job duties, what they'd be doing.
Got it. So just going back to medical marijuana for a minute, if you are an employer and you have a drug policy that prohibits drugs of any kind, does medical marijuana still impact that hiring decision, or do you get an exemption for that?
So, when you're updating and talking about your drug policies, and this is very general. So, there's a lot of federal laws that still require, the federal law has not made marijuana legal. It's still on their list of drugs that are illegal. So there's kind of a conflict there. You have to keep in mind that there are particular federal laws that, and depending on the industry you're in, that would require you to test for that especially like if you're in the transportation industry. So I'm not talking about that. This is just more general.
So really, the federal law becomes compliant with the states, then that would simplify things. But that doesn't seem like it's happening anytime real soon, does it?
It's not. And what we're really recommending with Pennsylvania employers is that, to have that statement in your policy where if somebody is a medical marijuana user, that is something that they need to inform their employer of, so that before they take that test, the employer will be, expect to see that as a result, and they can talk about, what does that mean? And do they have their medical marijuana card? And, there's an open kind of discussion or dialogue at that time.
Yeah, that's good guidance, I think, for employers at this point too.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the interviewing process now.
Sure.
Are there topics that should be avoided during an interview?
Yeah, so this relates back to, again, that's why we started with talking about the federal discrimination and state discrimination laws, is that you want to make sure that you're avoiding questions that relate to somebody's gender, their race, their national origin, a disability, their age. So those all sound like, I'm rattling off all of these big categories, but so I can give you some examples if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So one is, what do you do on Sundays? That might seem pretty, standard and basis. Yeah. And that there's not really much meaning behind it. And probably if somebody's asking that, they're not asking to find out any information that's illegal. But at the same time, if somebody responds to you, well, I go to church, or I go to Bible class, my kids go to CCD. So now you have some information about their religious beliefs. And although you're not going to use that information to make an employment decision, you have it. And so if something goes a little off track in the hiring process, and somebody thinks, well, I wonder if they didn't hire me because, I'm this religion and they're that religion.
I see.
They can show now that you had some information about their background. So really, you want to be as neutral as you can during the questions in the interview process. So another one might be, have you had any past workers' compensation claims? Oh. So you ask that question, and you might start to get into information about a health condition, a disability, an injury that they received. And so now, as an employer or potential employer, now before you're making these hiring decisions, you have information about a potential disability. And so then if something goes off track, then somebody might come back and say, well, I think you didn't hire me because I have this disability. And they'll be able to show that you had that information at the time you were making the hiring decision.
So there are some unexpected gotcha questions there. So from an employee perspective or interviewee perspective, if an employer asks you a question that you believe to be inappropriate or potentially illegal, is there a recommendation on how you should handle that?
It's interesting you're asking me from an employee standpoint, and that's really not something that I generally provide counsel on to employees. So I really probably wouldn't speak too much to that. I mean, just generally though, I think I would say that, if you're feeling uncomfortable about a position or a question that you think is not related to the job requirements. So that's the thing I would go back to, even when I'm talking to employers, as I would say, and what we can get a little more into this in a little bit, but what you're asking, is it job related? Is it related to the qualifications for the position? That's really what you want to go back to. And I would say from an employee standpoint, that's what you would focus on too. So if you're getting questions that you think aren't really related to the job qualifications, you could possibly respond in that way.
So we've talked about what shouldn't be asked. What kind of questions should be asked during an interview? One
issue might be that you, as an employer, want to make sure somebody has reliable transportation to get to work. And so that's a legitimate question to ask. Do you have transportation to work? Another might be what the hours are, or how many days of the week, right, that you need somebody in there. So if weekends are going to be, that's going to be part of somebody's schedule, it's okay to ask them, are you available to work on these particular days? If you want to know about an employee's past job, like how that works, you can ask them what the reason was that they resigned from a job, or if you have information that they've provided you that they were fired from a job, you can ask them about those reasons. And you can ask them what skills they've learned at their last job, especially because that's obviously going to be related to whether or not they're qualified for the job that you're interviewing them for.
So it sounds like I'm hearing a common theme here, that the questions should definitely relate to the responsibilities of the job.
Absolutely, yes.
So does it matter where employers advertise for these jobs?
Yeah, I think there should be some thought into, where you're posting these job requisites and where you're looking for employers. depending on what markets, or if you're doing more social media advertising, if you're on a job board, are you posting in the papers, and what are those newspapers or what are those social media outlets that you're posting in? It might disproportionately favor a particular class of individuals. So you want to make sure that you're careful about that. And you want to be careful probably about what the advertisement says. So for example, you want to be careful with, and not careful, but you should consider really, is it necessary? Are you really looking for somebody with a college education? Is that really a necessary requirement? Because you're probably, if you really think about the job position, some do, some don't. You might be pushing out a whole pool of qualified individuals that have, high school diplomas that, could disproportionately even affect a particular class of people.
Okay, I got it. So we're in the age of COVID, of course. The pandemic, seems to wane and then it comes back. But should you talk about the kind of COVID protocols you have, when you're interviewing someone?
I think so. I think COVID is on everybody's mind. I know we have, now that the vaccine's out and people are getting vaccinated, it seems maybe a little less, but I think that people are concerned coming back into the workforce. If you get people who haven't been working for a while, they want to know. I think they're going to want to know when they come to work for an employer that their safety is at the top of their employer's mind. So, I think that putting on the advertisement and during the recruiting and interviewing process, talking about what protocols you have in place. Like, somebody's going to want to know when they come into the workforce, are they going to wear a mask? Is everybody wearing a mask?
Sure.
And, with the vaccines, people are probably going to be asking, do they have to have a vaccine? Are they going to have to report if they have received the vaccine? So I think that's all important up front to include on your advertisements for the positions and to talk about in the recruiting and interviewing process.
So certainly full disclosure on all of that, and it puts both sides' minds at ease, I'm thinking here.
Absolutely.
So if you're an employer and you are putting a job application together, what are the kinds of things that must go on that application?
Okay. So I'm going to go back to, I think, with the common theme that we started talking about at the very beginning, which is you want to have a full equal employment opportunity statement on there. So that says that you're an equal opportunity employer and that you don't discriminate in your hiring, recruiting decisions based on anybody's protected status. So we talked about what those might be, like gender, race, disability, age. So you definitely want to have that on there. That's important.
Okay.
You want to have a statement on there if somebody does have a disability, how they can seek an accommodation for the recruiting process. So maybe somebody's not able to, fill out the application process. Maybe they need to call you and talk through the application process with you. So how would they do that? And then another good example is when you're talking about trying to figure out what level of education somebody has, instead of asking them what year they graduated on the application, which then can kind of give you some idea of maybe how old they are, and you don't really want to gather that information at this point because you don't want to make a decision, and we know you're not making a decision on age, and you don't want it to appear that you are. So you can put on there years of education or highest level of education without putting on, what year they graduated. So I always recommend.
So while people don't necessarily put their dates on resumes, especially if you're a little older, you're saying you can actually not have that requirement in a job application as well?
Yeah, at this point. Obviously, if you give somebody a conditional offer or you end up hiring them, you're going to eventually get that information. But you're just talking about at the beginning, right? Making those initial, whether or not somebody's qualified for the job, you really shouldn't be looking at age. So
age is a non-factor for the job unless it impacts the actual skills that are required.
Yeah, and that's really tricky because that has to be like a bona fide job requirement. And there are some more technical reasons why that might be. And you really have to back that up with some objective reasoning why it would be based on that. So generally, I think most employers, that is not going to be that's not going to be a job qualification requirement.
Got it.
That typically is not. So you wouldn't put that on there. And then the one other important thing I want to mention that I think most employers should have on their application for any job is that the employer or the applicant should understand that if they provide any information that's false, that could either be cause for them not to be hired or for the conditional offer to be retracted. And usually people sign off on those applications, they sign their name. So I like to put that right at the bottom so they understand that.
Okay, so if you, as an employer, you're not interested in a candidate, what can you actually tell the prospective employee about why you're not interested?
Because sometimes that can be the harder part, right? The awkward part that
Sure.
that employers don't have a hard time with. The biggest thing is you can understand is that you don't have to give a reason. You know, you don't have to give the reason why you didn't hire them. You can, if you're there at the interview at that point, you're likely not making a decision of whether or not you're going to hire somebody, but you could still just say something very, very simple, like, thank you for taking the time to interview for this position. And if we're interested, we will contact you. Or you will hear from us either way. I think I think that it's a good practice if you're able to follow up with all your job applicants, whether it's email or a phone call, and let them know either way. Because I mean, I've been in that position, right, mm-hmm. where you go for you're applying for a position, maybe you've interviewed once or twice, and then you don't hear from somebody. Right. You're just kind of sitting around waiting. Am I going to hear anything? You just want to hear either way. So I always think that that's a good practice.
It seems like a good professional protocol to follow, and it gives the candidate at least a little bit of a debrief as to what happened and why.
Exactly. That's a really good point, Paul. Yes, that's exactly right. And then if they do inquire, let's say that you do give them a call back, or sometimes, employees will follow up with you, or applicants will follow up with you. You can just say that, you filled the position with another candidate, and you don't really need to give any reason. The only reason, and you would do this through a process, is if you're making a decision based on somebody's criminal history background, there are requirements under that Pennsylvania Act for letting that employee know that the decision was made based on the criminal background. And there's a little more detail to that, but that's just
I get that. Okay, so that's interesting to hear. I know in my own experience where sometimes I've interviewed and maybe didn't get that particular position, an employer has come back and I've later, had an interview and actually received a job from a different position. So never good to burn any bridges, I suppose. No. Switching directions a little bit here. I know the concept of an exempt employee versus a non-exempt employee. Can you talk a little bit about the distinctions?
To get a little legal, so there's a federal law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, and we call it short the FLSA. And it's a federal law that sets like the federal minimum wage and overtime requirements. Overtime in Pennsylvania really mirrors the Fair Labor Standards Act. So the Pennsylvania wage and hour laws mirror that. And what that requires is that employers pay employees overtime for any hours worked in excess of 40 hours. Okay. And they're paid at 1.5 times their regular rate. So that's what the act requires. Now, determining whether or not your employees fall under that act, if you're required to pay them that overtime, that's a really complicated and really fact-intensive decision. But overall, what you're looking at is typically employee who's deemed non-exempt. That means they're not exempt from the overtime rules. That means that you as the employer have to pay them overtime.
Okay.
If you are an exempt employee, that means that you're exempt from having to pay this employee overtime. And what makes the difference between exempt and non-exempt is salary. So the threshold it's $684 per week. So if you have an employee who is under that, they're making less than $684 a week, your employee is going to be non-exempt, which means you have to pay them overtime.
Is that irrespective of whether they're hourly or salary?
That is correct. So even if you're saying that they're a salary employee, if they're making less than $684, that's baseline decision. So then, if you have an employee who's making more than the $684 per week, then you look at to see, well, what kind of job are they in? So you're exempt if you are in an administrative, professional, or an executive role. And I could spend 3 days talking about what those three things mean and if somebody falls under those. But just like as an overview, that's kind of what you're looking at. You have 2 buckets of employees. There is a test, a standard that you look at to determine if somebody falls in exempt or non-exempt. And that's really going to be the difference between mainly whether or not you're paying them overtime.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So we've all experienced remote working now, and COVID has kind of changed the way we probably work forever. Can you talk a little bit about how that's impacting recruiting and hiring?
One of the ways is that people are now looking at a wider range of job options too. So when before you were living in southwestern or Northwestern Pennsylvania. And there weren't, before the pandemic, there was remote work, but not to the extent there is now. You were more limited in what companies and employers were looking at. So now, I think the competition for employers has grown because there's a lot of remote work positions. So I can be in Pennsylvania and working for a company that probably 5 years ago I would have had to live in California for. So that's part of it. So there's more competition. And then you have the virtual interviewing, which that can be pros and cons too. So it's more efficient, it's easier, right? So you don't have to take up as much time to do that interviewing process, and maybe you're able to meet more individuals. So, whereas before maybe you go into an office and you meet with one or two people,
sure,
and the rest would be in a different office location, you wouldn't get to meet everybody. Now, you can get on in an hour and meet 10 individuals, right?
Yeah.
And have that opportunity to learn more information about the employer and more of the employer's staff getting to know this potential candidate. So that's always helpful.
It expands your reach in terms of interviewing if you're able to use the mobile format or the virtual format.
Right. So I would say those are two ways that remote work has impacted the recruiting and hiring process.
Well, that's great. Raeann, you showed a lot of information with us today. I think it's really been helpful. I hope our employer audience incorporates a lot of what you said into their processes here. I really want to thank you for taking the time today to meet with us. And to the audience, as I said, this is the first of 3 chamber chats that we'll be doing. So we look forward to having you join us again for the second and third iterations of this. And thank you for your time today, Raeann.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and I appreciate it. Thanks.
Talk again soon. Thanks.
You too.